The sacrum is the most inferior region of the vertebral column if you discount the coccyx, which we'll mention at the tail end of this video. This bone was called the os sacrum in Latin, which translates into sacred bone. The reason it was called the sacred bone isn't absolutely clear, but what is certain is that the sacrum is an important component of the pelvis, which is the platform that supports the lower limbs. Here is a closer view of what appears to be a male pelvis. And here is what appears to be a female pelvis, isolated from the skeleton. If we further isolate the sacrum, we note that it is somewhat triangular in shape. This triangular shape enables us to refer to the superior part of the bone as the base of the triangle, and the inferior part as the apex of the triangle. Now let's look at this very nice illustration of the sacrum from both the anterior and posterior views. If we look at the anterior view, we can clearly see a key feature of this bone, which is that it consists of the fusion of 5 vertebrae, numbered S1 to S5. If we take a look at this illustration from Gray's Anatomy, which looks like a male pelvis again, and isolate the sacrum again, we can again note that the 5 fused sacral vertebrae form this bone. We can clearly see in this illustration where the bodies of the vertebrae have fused. This is indicated by 4 lines that indicate the places of fusion, and these lines are called transverse lines. Here is a specimen that came from a plastic skeleton, and I show this to illustrate how these transverse lines are not always obvious. So here you can see the locations of the transverse lines highlighted. Another consequence of this fusion is that the processes of the vertebrae fuse, but in a way that still permits the exit of sacral spinal nerves and their anterior and posterior branches. So here we can see the openings for these nerves, which are called the anterior sacral foramina. The anterior superior edge of the body of S1 juts out in a way that suggests a jutting cliff or promontory. And this feature is called the sacral promontory. The processes of S1 are fused and expand outward from the body in a way that suggests wings. We will see in a second that the ends of these wings will form a strong articulation with the hip bone. These expanded regions are called the sacral ali, which is plural for ala, which means wing. Here is another look at our isolated pelvis, and we can see why these expanded lateral parts of S1 were called wings or ali by the anatomist. Before moving on, let's stop and ponder why the sacral vertebrae fuse to form a single bone. The sacrum, as already noted, is going to form the pelvis by articulating with the hip bones. This articulation needs to be strong. There are also going to be a number of muscles that attach to the bone and put a lot of stress on it. So what we need here primarily is stability. And we get this stability by sacrificing mobility. And the best way for these bones to gain stability is by fusion. So all the unique characteristics of this bone reflect this fusion. So now that we got this important point out of the way, let's take another look at the isolated sacrum from a superior view. And again, note the body and the sacral ali that extends from the body. Another feature to note are the processes which are the superior articular processes of S1, which will articulate with the inferior articular processes of the 5th lumbar vertebra. If we take a look at a lateral view of the sacrum, we can get a better idea of how the sacrum articulates with the hip bone. First, let's note again how the superior edge of the body of S1 juts out over the concavity of the anterior surface of the sacrum, and this is called, again, the sacral promontory. The surface that forms the articulation with the hip bone resembles the shape of an ear. For this reason, it is called the auricular surface, or the ear-like surface. We want this surface to be relatively immobile and strong. To add to the strength of this articulation, ligaments are going to cross it, and the place where ligaments attach to the sacrum is indicated by an elevated part of the bone above and behind the auricular surface, which is also rough because of this attachment. This rough raised area is called the sacral tuberosity. From the lateral perspective, we can see a feature of the posterior side, which is formed by the spinous processes of the fused vertebrae. These spinous processes form what is called the median sacral crest. Here is a posterior view of the sacrum. We can again note the superior articular processes, which bear the superior articular facets. We can see the tips of the fused spinous processes, which are going to collectively form the median sacral crest. The transverse processes also fuse at their distal ends to form what is called the lateral sacral crest. You can also see the openings for the posterior branches of the spinal nerves, which are called the posterior sacral foramina. Now let's review what we've covered so far with this drawing of the posterior side of the sacrum. Here are the superior articular processes with their superior articular facets. Here is the median sacral crest. Here are the lateral sacral crests. Here are the posterior sacral foramina. And here the entrance to the sacral canal is indicated. At the other end of the sacral canal, the roof fails to form, which leaves a gap. This gap is called the sacral hiatus. 3 to 5 coccygeal vertebrae that would support a tail that doesn't exist in humans, fuse to form the coccyx. In order to appreciate what the sacral canal is, let's look again at this lateral view and then look at a mid-sagittal section. This opens up for us the sacral canal, which is basically a continuation of the vertebral canal. Here are posterior views of 2 actual specimens of sacra. If we take a closer look at the one on the left, we again note the sacral hiatus. Another feature to note are the bumps on the wall of the sacral canal that remains. These bumps stick out like horns, and the Latin word for horn is cornu. So one of these is a sacral cornu, and the plural of cornu is cornua. So we have the sacral cornua. If we look at the sacrum on the right, we can again note the same features: the sacral hiatus and the sacral cornua. As promised at the end of this video, we will talk about the tailbone, the coccyx. But first I'd like to acknowledge the source of this nice illustration. It comes from OpenStax College, and you can find this illustration at this address. The figure nicely illustrates the coccyx. If you look closely at the coccyx, you can see it results from the fusion of at least 3 vertebrae, and possibly 4 in this example. Here again we can see the sacral cornua, and here are cornua on the coccyx. The coccyx is the end of the vertebral column, and this is the end of our video. As always, if you'd like to take a quiz, there is a link to a quiz in the description below. And here we have Apollo, and he's a little bit confused about whether he should hunt this mouse, or there's a couple of other mouses around that he is interested in. But he's a bit confused. He's not sure. Well, maybe not. He's protesting his confusion right now. Well, he's not confused about his tail, obviously.